Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Well, it's good to be back. I took the summer off. It's now September, and our guest on today's show was scheduled to come in May, and she sent me an email a couple weeks ago, and she said, Bill, it's time to go back to work. And so thanks to Carrie Ingram, who's a very interesting expert in all things education, we're back today relaunching, coming off the sabbatical, starting the show to talk about education, schooling in America, K-12, what we can do about it, what we have to do about it. I think it's hard to one thing to remember, that with K-12 in America, we're talking about the largest government monopoly in the world, except for a few monopolies in China, of course. But with 52 million kids enrolled in schools around the country, it's also the largest single source of indoctrination that we're facing with. And of course, I think it's well known that the teachers' unions contribute virtually 99% of their contribution money to Democratic candidates. So as we look at changing our culture, changing kids, and feeling good about the future of America, we've got to do something about K-12. We also have to do something about colleges and related. And Carrie is the person to talk with about this. She's a senior fellow at Discovery Institute and also director of the Institute's American Center for Transforming Education. She's also a senior fellow at the terrific Independent Women's Forum, and we had Carrie Sheffield on here several times from the forum, and a source of very, very brilliant people and experts on all things that you want to know about. So, Carrie, welcome.
Thanks, Bill. Pleasure to be here.
So, K-12. I mean, you've written so well on so many other things. How should we attack this problem? How are you thinking about it at the Center for Transforming Education? How do we transform education?
Well, I'll tell you, Bill, about 5 years ago, before I was at Discovery Institute, the Education Center was primarily focused on public school reform. So looking at those district public schools. But what happened during COVID, this great parent awakening, the prolonged school closures, parents had a front row seat into their child's classroom, and they were able to see what was being taught as well as what wasn't being taught. And parents became very concerned. They spoke up, and as their concerns were ignored, their voices were silenced, many started looking elsewhere for the education of their children. And as a result, we've just seen sweeping school choice legislation as those parents' voices have been heard by Republican legislators. And so now the strategy is the fastest, most effective way to reform public education is to allow families to exit the system. And as they leave, that'll be the opportunity to defund the teacher unions, just enormous power, break that stranglehold they have on this pipeline of children, but also bring the element of competition and all the benefits that competition brings to the market: accountability, transparency, it spurs innovation, drives down costs. And so we're seeing that strategy of education freedom being the really the power and the driver to public education reform today.
So how is it manifesting? What's an example in a local community? Is there anybody that's gotten out of the public school system that escaped the jail that, at least I think of it as a jail?
Great question. So 4 years ago, in 2020, there is very few children in our country that had the ability to go to a school other than their district assigned public school based upon their zip code, unless their parents are able to homeschool or have tuition money for a private school. But over the last 4 years, we've seen tremendous gains in school choice policies, including 12 states today have now universal or near universal school choice. And what that means is every child in the state has the opportunity to go to a school that their parents select. And so it's breaking up that monopoly. 12 states so far, which is incredible in 4 years, more on the horizon. And we can't stop there. Every child needs the opportunity to a high quality education. And unfortunately, public schools have just maintained the status quo, and they're not delivering that for 70% of their students are not exiting proficient across subjects. And so there's a better way, and the better way is giving the money to parents and empowering them to select the avenue that's going to best serve their child as well as align with their values.
So is this school choice we're talking about? Is this charter schools, or what's the alternative if you're a parent with a second grader?
Yeah, school choice. And the term has changed a little bit over the last few years as education's being reinvented. So it's not just school choice anymore, but we consider it education freedom, because that money can be used not just for a traditional brick and mortar school, but for homeschool. The funds can be applied to micro schools, hybrid, a variety of educational avenues. And the great thing with some of these policies in various states is parents are incentivized to be good stewards of that money for their child's education. And if they don't spend it all in a given year, they're able to save it for their child's post-high school education, college or career, technical education.
Well, just the whole concept of schools, it is really the government-run schools. People, I grew up going to a public PS 86 public school in Indianapolis, and it was just sort of a fact that that's where you would send it to the local government-run building. But, the whole notion of public education really started percolating after the Civil War and then on into the progressive era, with Woodrow Wilson and all the other people who were interested not so much in education, but really in controlling kids and making it an instrument of a political agenda, even back then. And have you ever heard of John Gatto's, John Taylor Gatto? He was a New York City teacher and exited after a while because he disliked what schools had become, and that he even back in 1922, the New York City mayor said that schools have been seized by an invisible government. And the thing, by the way, just sort of my background, I've started up several schools or education-related businesses myself. Sarah and I created a children's language program, Spanish and French, for kids JK through sixth grade, teaching Spanish and French. And we ended up in about, I don't know, Sarah's off camera here, about how many? 20,000 students in about 8 states, yeah. And then we also had I also had an inner-city reading program, teaching kids. It was a pull-out program, teaching kids in inner-city school. And then later on in private equity, I owned a private K-12, not K-12, K-8 school chain, and then a lot of software-related businesses teaching education. So I've been mining in these, laboring in these mines for almost 40 years. And I began to think of what was happening in schools as really an indoctrination machine. And they're not so much interested in education, reading, writing, and arithmetic, which is why their proficiency scores are so level, as they are now in inculcating values that most parents don't share. You've written about that.
Yes. On a world stage, U.S. students just aren't competitive. So there's an international test, and 15-year-old students take that around the world. We're seeing that U.S. students in the most recent test, they were scoring 9th in reading, 16th in science, and 34 in math against other countries. And so we've got to get back in education where we're teaching the very basics, prepare our kids, because if we don't, that has workforce development implications, economic implications for our country, societal, as well as national security. But what they're teaching instead, because of the power of those teacher unions, those far left progressive ideologies, is this worldview that's hostile to what the vast majority of Americans are teaching their children at home. And so we got to provide a way that parents
Amplify.
can
What's the worldview they're pushing? I know, but I would like you to share it with our listeners.
Yeah, across subjects. We've got critical race theory being embedded, just an attack on the basic identity of children. This radical gender ideology as well is happening in schools. There's a redefining of history with inaccurate historical facts, and this notion that all these institutions, including education in our country, is systemically racist. So that's happening, as well as on an economic side. And so capitalism, free markets, the basic economic principles our country are founded on, those are taught as wrong, ineffective, and also to the point of evil in public schools as low as elementary, where socialism, Marxism, those things are taught and celebrated. So when kids exit the system, there's no doubt what they're going to vote for, which party and which policies that they've been indoctrinated with for 13 years.
Well,
I get an off. Yesterday there was another school shooting, and they're still saying keep the 10 Commandments out of the schools. You know.
Yeah, I don't know that we can hear that, but the point of even the school shootings they're driving the 10 Commandments out of schools. We always ask the question, which commandment do you have a problem with? But anyway, I don't want to get all theological today. But when we talk about education, let's stipulate that it's not just you sort of see the building, you see the teachers, but there's also the curriculum, the textbook publishers, the school consultants, the school boards, all the people involved in education. There are about 6 or 7 million people involved in education in America right now at the professional level. Is that about the right number?
Yep.
And they're almost monolithically Democrat. And they, if you're running a school in Kansas City, you're going to end up with the same textbooks as you end up with in New York City or Los Angeles, or even in even a place like remote rural corner of Mississippi. You're left with a lot of traditional choices from the textbook publishers that are all hard left. I mean, they're teaching Howard Zinn, who would teach you that America is the worst place on the planet. That's become a standard textbook in a lot of high schools in America.
Yeah. So much of it starts back in the schools of education. So because of the states requiring teachers to be certified and controlling that pipeline where they've got to get the certificate through a school of education, well, even at more conservative colleges and universities today, the faculty are products of K-12 education, public, as well as where they spent their early career. And so their worldview that they bring into those institutions and then teach these upcoming teachers is of a single political party. It's very progressive. And then when those teachers enter the classroom, they've got the curriculum selected by the curriculum directors who have come through this same pipeline. It's what they're taught in their teacher training, which is controlled by the teacher unions. And the cycle just continues. And so allowing families to exit, as well as breaking down some of these mandates on teachers, creating a new pipeline where teachers can enter the workforce would be really effective, because what we're doing today is not in the best interest of the future of our country, and it's failing to educate kids.
Hey, it's Bill Walton, and it's great to be back from a summer break with Carrie Ingram of the Discovery Institute, and we're trying to figure out how to get our kids really educated. And maybe it involves having them not be in the schools that we're offering them today. The thing about the teachers' colleges is that I think of this as, I used to be in the private equity business and ran some companies, and you're very dependent on the kind of people, the quality of talent you can hire. And if you look at the average teacher college within a big university, correct me if I'm wrong, but I looked at this, 10 years ago, and the average SAT scores of the kids enrolled, of the young people enrolled in the teachers' colleges, are on average about 200 or 300 points lower than most of the rest of the colleges in the university, the English departments, the math departments, the business schools, that sort of thing. And so we're not exactly attracting the best and brightest in the teachers' colleges. And then they graduate and they go out and they're in charge of your second grader. And, you know, I went to public school in the 50s, and, you know, part of this was the demographic changes and the opportunities for women. And the opportunities for women in the 50s were not nearly what they are now. And so a lot of people who were our teachers back then are now lawyers, doctors, or they're working for Independent Women's Forum or the Discovery Institute. And so I don't think we've got the talent in the teacher corps. Now, point out to me where I'm wrong about that. I would love to have more positive view about school teachers than I do right now.
Well, Bill, you're exactly right. And so the bar is really low to enter those teacher college programs. It's typically the easiest field to go into within the university. And so you're not getting the best and the brightest. Also, those students aren't being challenged with a lot of rigor. And so oftentimes some of the highest GPAs at the colleges and universities are those in the teacher program, despite not being the best and brightest students going into those.
Participation awards, trophies.
Yes, sometimes. And that's not to say that there's not incredible people that go through those programs.
Yeah.
But the system isn't designed to attract those that we really need to eventually get in the classroom. And then when you get there, the teacher pay does not reward performance. It's another incentive that's wrong. It also ignores subject matter experts. And so in our country right now, we've got a shortage of upper science teachers, math teachers, special education teachers. Well, when you're not financially incentivizing, you know, people with advanced degrees in science, math, STEM to come into the teaching profession, as well as saying you've got to go back to a school of education and get a teacher certificate, despite the fact that you might have a doctorate in one of these fields, we're hindering the quality of education being delivered to kids in the classroom.
Well, in our language program, it was an immersion program, and it required the teachers to speak Spanish or French fluently, because that's the way kids learn, and we all learn when you're immersed in the language. And I remember one program we had set up in Carmel Clay in Indianapolis, or Indiana, and we had 8 teachers hired, and a couple of them were PhDs even, one of them from Spain, and they were all fluent in the languages. And about 2 weeks before we were starting our program, we were told by the union, well, you can't bring these teachers into the school. They don't have teacher certificates. And we had to get rid of them. And we ended up having to hire teachers that had a teacher certificate, but they couldn't speak the language.
Yeah. Although the woman who was head of the program...
She was wonderful. The head of curriculum was wonderful. She was appalled, but that wasn't her fault. But so that's the kind of situation we're up against. Don Graham, who was publisher of the Washington Post, was a history major at Harvard, wildly immersed in history, knew a lot about it, and he tried to volunteer to teach in the District of Columbia Public Schools. Didn't have a teacher's certificate, so he couldn't do it. I mean, just barriers like that, and then the teachers' unions don't want performance pay. I mean, they've blocked that every time we bring it up.
Yes, and so what we're doing without that performance pay is people eventually leave the field, or they lose the motivation. And some of the worst teachers don't leave the field because they're incentivized. You know, I'm going to get a salary increase each year for just remaining in this position. Because of those teacher union laws, it's really difficult to fire even horrific teachers, things that are happening inappropriate in the classroom, poor education of their students where the kids aren't learning. But the unions are so strong, those teachers stay, and to the detriment of these students who they can't afford to be in a class for a year or year after year with teachers who aren't subject matter experts, who aren't engaged and with a driving passion to every day educate those children, to inspire them, to motivate them, to hold high expectations. And it's a culture of our schools where kids just aren't getting the best. But like I've said, allowing parents the opportunity to exit the system is a solution. And when enough parents do that, those public schools are going to have to take notice. The teacher unions are going to see that their best educators are going to exit into these new opportunities to serve kids, whether it's a micro school, a brick and mortar school. We saw in COVID just an explosion of not just families leaving public education, but also educators. They said there's a better way, and it's the best and the brightest, those that are motivated, that are leaving, because they can be in control of their future. They're not stuck on a salary schedule that ignores their performance, their expertise, and they're able to get in these environments, like through a micro school that they might start, where they can teach high quality academics and their hands aren't tied by being stuck to some of these political indoctrinating ideologies that they're told to teach.
So I came to the view that the existing schools, and I would not say just K-12, but I'd also say universities, are not really reformable. And, you know, I mentioned that I think I cited you. You were the one that wrote that they were the largest government monopoly in the world. And I don't think there's an example of a government or a big institution that successfully reformed itself. What usually happens is new institutions, new things spring up, they thrive, people are attracted to that, the market works, and if you're not delivering something people want, they go to the things that do. And so the strategy here seems to be what you're doing, which is to create new ways to learn and let the schools atrophy and eventually die out.
And they may not ever die out. You know, there's always going to be a percentage of people that opt to send their child to the neighborhood school. But that teacher union power and that ineffective education, the way to root that out as much as possible, I think it's always going to be there in public education because of the bureaucracy, because of those incentives being off, is to get people to exit. Now, 12 states have done that sweepingly for all kids, more on the way, like I said. But in some of these blue states where that's farther off, our work is not forgiving.
I'd say further off would be like an understatement.
Yes. Well, you know, at some point,
when hell freezes over, I think.
The economic implications of that workforce,
Yeah.
they aren't going to be able to ignore that forever. But in turn, for those kids that are still in the public school, we haven't given up on them. There's always going to be those kids there. But we're going to use the opportunity to take people out, to force them to change because of the element of competition, and then work on some of those levers, like removing the teacher certification barrier, reforming teacher pay to incentivize through performance, updating graduation requirements. You know, those haven't been updated in decades, but the workforce needs today are dramatically different because of the technology advancements. So those will be the things that we're working on, but we're not going to right now spend all of our effort, you know, beat it against a brick wall.
Well, you're really good because, you know, I think there are a lot of things people, when they think about it, they get right away, but there's some things that are not obvious. One of them is for big cities, schools are the mayor's largest form of patronage. And not just the teachers, but all the administrators. I mean, if you walk into as I did, you know, what was it, Pershing Hall or something like that, named after, very appropriate, the guy that ran the Army in World War I, Jack Pershing. They set up a big headquarters in Chicago, one of these football field-sized places for bureaucrats. And when the Army vacated the premises, the schools of Chicago took it over. So that's the Army barracks, or the Army offices are now schools. It's filled with patronage jobs, and so the fight to keep that in place is to the death, I think.
And their strategy is to say, you know, we're underfunded, we need more money. Well, they need more money because they continue to hire more non-teaching staff. So non-teaching staff, they've added 4 times as many non-teaching staff, despite enrollment staying about consistent over the last several decades. And why they do that is that equals more paying union members.
Patronage.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you mean we don't need all those DEI officers in the schools? Of course.
Definitely not.
Sacrilege.
And we need to reprioritize who is being hired.
Okay,
Those subject matter experts.
So when we talk about we, though, who is the we, and what are the alternatives that we really offer parents? I mean, if you're in a suburban school in Schaumburg, Illinois, maybe that's a bad example. Although those schools, they look great, but I don't think they're delivering the quality of education, the schooling that people would really appreciate if they got a good curriculum. How do you escape and go to someplace else, and what are those things, and how are they funded? And who's driving the bus here?
Well, right now, there's a lot of us who are education reformers focused on school choice. We're educating lawmakers. We're amplifying the voice of parents. And so why I said 12 states have this universal school choice more on the way, other states have made tremendous groundwork over the last few years of expanding that. But then you've got to make sure that parents get the word and they know. So different states are doing it different. There's outreach efforts to parents. Sometimes in a state there might be like a school finder so that they know you have other opportunities. And then also growing the supply. So just like you were involved as a businessman starting education companies, today we're seeing the business community say, I'm not getting kids, this future workforce that are coming prepared. How can I make a difference? Well, I can take my subject matter expertise, I can take my industry knowledge, my network, and I can start an industry-specific high school, whether it's a private school, micro school, or even a charter school, and equip students in something that they're going to be passionate about and give them an on-ramp
But how do you
success.
get that? How do you get that accredited, though? Because one of the things as I mentioned, there are all these institutions involved in the current blob. And accreditation is a big one, and you have to jump through certain hoops to get accredited. And very often, the accreditors want you to do the same old stuff that the government schools are doing right now, so you can't do anything new.
Well, there's a host of accreditation agencies. On the micro school side right now, those schools are not initially having to be accredited. And so in time, as they pop up more and more, that might come about. Private schools are able to get accreditation through multiple avenues, so they don't necessarily have to go through.
But is that accreditation accepted by colleges if you want to get your
Yes.
kid into college? So if you want to go to Harvard and you're accredited by one of these rogue accreditation agencies, that they're going to accept that?
And there are some that have been in place for a very long time
What
that are very
are some of
large.
the name some?
The Association of Christian Schools International is
Okay.
one example.
Yeah.
Students go to all the top schools in the country with that. It's not a roadblock. It's not a hindrance. And that's just one example. But there are some that are not beholden to those progressive ideologies that are accrediting these schools. Students are thriving. And so they are able to bypass what could be that roadblock.
So are most of the alternatives Christian related, or are there more secular alternatives?
As far as the accreditation,
Accreditation and just alternatives places to have your kids learn something.
yeah, well, what we've seen the last couple of years is classical education has exploded, Christian, Catholic, as well as non-religious. So over the last 4 years, there's been more than a 5% growth rate in the launch of new classical schools.
What's a classical school?
A classical school would be focused on the great books, a focus of the love of learning, teaching about the good, the true, the beautiful, high academic standards.
So sort of the
also
University of Chicago had
character.
its Great Books program. It's based on that, something like that.
Yes. And parents, a lot of parents don't even know what classical education is, but they see the difference in either their friends' kids or things they hear, and they know this is completely different. Kids are excited about learning. They're motivated, they're challenged, and the content is so different than what they saw in those remote Zoom sessions that parents are seeking this out. And in turn, you've got a pipeline of educators that are saying, I want to leave the public school. I don't want to be bound by this curriculum. I want to inspire and challenge kids. That's why I got into education. And so they're growing the pipeline by great educators, starting these micro schools as well.
Now, micro school, do you go to a school and you're there all day, or what is it? Because let me amplify my question. I had a friend, it was when I was doing my education, entrepreneuring, who ran a program for kids who had dropped out of high school, or they'd gotten into trouble for disciplinary reasons. And what he would do is he'd go to the education people there and say, "Look, I'll take these kids and I'll get them proficient in these skills so they can graduate from high school, but I'll take them off your hands." And he had them come into storefronts in suburban malls where they had computers there, and this was, gosh, 30 years ago, quite primitive. And he'd have the kids in there only for 2 or 3 hours a day, working on math, working on history, working on kind of the hard stuff. And then that was it. He'd let them go off and work part-time and do other things during, I don't know how many of them went down to the art museum to do their cultural piece, but there was that opportunity. Do we really need to have kids go to school and sit there for 8 hours a day or however long it is and just be, in effect, a captive of that building?
Well, that's a great point. Homeschool parents have proven this for such a long time that you can accomplish so much more in a shorter period of time because their kids aren't spending, upwards of hours lining up, walking to each class, moving back and forth, lunch, recess, those types of things. They can knock out in the morning so much more academic content in an effective way, in a focused environment. They're not dealing with all these distractions, whether it's cell phones or bad behavior, which is happening in those traditional classrooms. And so they do have a lot more time for enrichment, for their kids to be involved, whether it's service learning, volunteering, internships as they're older. So it's a really effective model when you're in a smaller environment. Also, educators can tailor things. So in a micro school, it simply just means it's a small school. There might just be a dozen students, but the parents get a lot more feedback and their voice is heard.
Well, how much of the burden falls back on the parents, though? I mean, one of the realities is that school's a form of daycare, and that for families that have to have 2 jobs, 2 wage earners, things like that, they can't do all the things you need to homeschool. They don't have the time or maybe the expertise to do it, even though, and frankly, it's exhausting to do some of that. So how many of these alternatives are solve that problem, but also use some of these new techniques to actually have kids learn stuff?
Quite the variety. So pre-COVID, very few micro schools. You gave a great example of a front runner one. But today, there's a couple million kids educated in this micro school environment. Some are full-time, and even with an extended day for working parents. Others are a hybrid model where the kids come to school 2 to 3 days a week, and the parents supplement the learning the rest of the time. So parents know on the front end what the expectation is, what their responsibility is, and they choose that school that's going to work with their schedule, fit with their values, their expectations. And then other micro schools are fully online, a virtual setting for those kids who will thrive in that environment. And let me just say, virtual learning is not the same as a COVID remote school shutdown learning. It was very haphazard. The educators were forced into it. The curriculum wasn't designed for it. But online learning can be really effective when the teachers are trained in it, the curriculum is designed for that delivery model, parents are engaged, and for the kids that maybe need to move a little faster, move slower, or be freed up with more time to engage in something that they're gifted in, whether it's the arts, athletics, or some career training while they're still in their middle school and high school years.
How many kids, well, so many questions here, but I'd like to put some specifics on this. We mentioned millions, people doing in these states. What are some, if I'm a parent listening to this, okay, this all sounds great. Who are the resources? Who are the people I go to that let me know how this is happening and how I can take advantage of it? Because I don't have kids in that age group anymore, so I don't have any need to know. But is there a cottage industry of consultants and online resources available for parents to find out how to make this happen?
Great question. I think the first step for them is to just Google in their state, just an internet search of what's available. Is there school choice in my state? Is the very first question parents, should be searching online. And then once they see that and they see the opportunities, then to be more specific because it varies so widely. And then the next step, if it says school choice, would be what funding is available for school choice. Can I use that funding beyond a private brick and mortar school? Can I homeschool with state funding? And figure out the basics that way, and then start looking for providers in their area, either brick and mortar schools, homeschool co-ops, hybrid schools, where they can take advantage of that.
But this is for the ambitious middle-class person, perhaps. I mean, what do you do about the inner city kids that don't have parents that are that involved? I mean, when we ran our reading program, we had Parents' Night, and this is in South Side Chicago, inner city. And we had these kids that were in the bottom 10% of their class. The school liked us because we were taking the biggest behavior issues and helping them succeed. So we called it Success Lab. But we'd have Parents' Night, and it broke your heart because nobody showed up. Maybe an aunt or grandmother, things like that. I mean, what about that mass of kids that don't have the kind of involved parents that are going to do this? I mean, we're just going to relegate them?
Well, I mean, you're exactly right. So there's always going to be early adopters of new things, new innovation, new opportunities.
Yeah.
That can be middle or upper class, maybe more educated, more resourceful, more engaged. But there was a study done late last year. The results were released in January, a large-scale study that showed 72% of parents considered a new school for their child last year. That's incredible. And that's a result of what we call this great parent awakening that happened during COVID. And micro schools, as we talked about earlier, a lot of the students that are coming to micro schools are low income, minority students. And so it's a new day in education where parents, they've just been exposed. And so they're being so resourceful to say, I got to figure out a way to get my kid out of this. I'm seeing that they can't read. They should be reading by now. They're discouraged. They're miserable. And so today it's a little bit different dynamic because they saw front row seat what was happening in those schools.
So you're going to go to a seminar after we finish taping here, or a group at American Enterprise Institute. What are you all trying to accomplish there?
Yeah, I've got some great friends and colleagues over at the American Enterprise Institute. They have a network called the Conservative Education Reform Network. I believe there's over 1,000 members around the country.
And how do we find that Conservative Education Reform Network? That's all online? That's
Yep, if you would search that out. As part of our network, we've put together a playbook. They've published that a few times. They keep updating and expanding it. And it's a playbook for governors, for state politicians, because K-12 education is largely governed at the state level, of these ideas of how do you actually transform K-12 education. I wrote a few chapters in there, one on teacher certification as a barrier, one as reforming teacher pay, also hybrid schools was something else I explored in there. And so this gives governors the opportunity to say, the research says this, it's a very condensed package strategy, but it also explains for them what legislation would actually need to change to make this a reality in their state. And so that's one of the things we do. We also reach out to parents to make sure they're educated.
Let's talk about certification, if you've written on that. I mean, one of the stunning things I saw when I looked into our issue about not having certified teachers, I said, okay, well, what kind of skills do you get when you go to a teacher's college? And it turns out in a teacher's college, you don't learn anything about classroom instruction. You learn theory, or you learn indoctrination, or you learn critical race theory. I mean, you look. Everybody ought to go look online to see what the classes are offered in these teachers' colleges. They're not about teaching. They're about a lot of other things, anything but that. And so you get certified. You're certified to do what? Talk about critical race theory. You're not prepared for classroom instruction, discipline in the classroom, how to handle an actual event. So that's sort of my you're getting a lot of frustration in that question, but what's it take to get certified now, and how do we change all that so you can get people who are actually qualified to teach certified?
Working on breaking down those certification laws.
First, do you agree with my assessment?
Yes.
Okay.
Definitely. And byproduct of COVID was we had a lot of teachers exit the field. They didn't like teaching online. They got burnt out. You know, how can you have a classroom of kindergarten students who can't read sitting in front of a screen? You know, you're trying to babysit them over the screen for hours. And as that went on year after year through COVID, in some states spanning 3 years, they said, I've had enough. So they've exited the profession. They haven't rejoined. So there was a teacher shortage. And as a result, states had to allow exceptions around the teacher certification. And now there's the opportunity to continue that because that barrier is starting to be broken down.
Good. Push it. Yeah, you know, it's funny. I was reading. I've talked about John Taylor Gatto, but he died a couple of years ago. But he was a very interesting man because he talked about this creation of the public schools back in the late 1800s, early 20th century, 1800, yeah, 19th century, early 20th century, and it was a progressive institution. It was a progressive experiment, and we've seen how the progressives have kind of worked their way in. And by the way, that's a lovely word that they stole because it basically means a lot of totalitarian things. But anyway, the schools were originally designed to get people off the street and under the control of what they called then the education trust. The education trust. Think about that. And the ideal was for them was to impose subordination. And they wanted the students in these schools to be thinking of themselves as employees, not entrepreneurs. And they were terrified that people would continue to work for themselves. When I read that, I thought, my God, this was 100 years ago, and fast forward to today. And they also said in 1919, a fellow named Arthur Calhoun, who was one of the Education Trust, wrote, "The child was passing from the family into the community, into the hands of the custody of community experts." He wrote, "Expect in time to see a system of public education designed to check the mating of the unfit." And that was back in the Margaret Sanger, population control world, which I know Independent Women's Forum's done a lot of work on. But also you think about what's happening now where parents are not allowed to know what's happening with their children's sex, the trans issues and all this stuff that's they're keeping parents from. This was actually on their mind 100 years ago.
Public education was designed to say these educators, they are the experts, not just of the child's education, but of the child. And so they began to push parents out to minimize them in education. And that's exactly the opposite of what the research says. The research says the number one indicator of a student's academic success is parental involvement in their education. And so they've pushed parents out. They've told parents, we're the expert, we got this. And then it's gone as far, to your point, as operating in secrets from moms and dads. These are parents who have raised their children. They've known them since birth. They're going to be involved in their lives far past the school year when those teachers come and go. They have a legal obligation as the authority, as a guardian, as a parent, to know what's going on. And even their consent has been taken away. California, under Gavin Newsom, recently passed a law saying that it's a first in the nation that schools are not required to tell a parent of their child's gender ideology unless that child gives permission. That child. Again, these are minor age children who are being taught crazy things at school. It's moms and dads who are after their best interest. And so we're working on combating that. I recently wrote an article for the Epoch Times just exposing the reality. Ryan T. Anderson wrote about this in his book, When Harry...
Ryan Anderson at Heritage?
Yes.
Yeah, or he used to be at Heritage.
Used to be at Heritage. When Harry became Sally. And in that book, he points to research that shows 80 to 95% of children will outgrow this gender ideology, this confusion, if they're just allowed to develop naturally. But as soon as the schools put them on this social transition, new names, new pronouns, wardrobe changes, it leads them down this quick progression to puberty blockers, next is cross-sex hormones, and then these radical surgeries that are irreversible. And so they're making medical dependent patients for life without mom and dad even being involved. And these are children. Think about when you were just a child, we often had silly notions and big imaginations. And we've got to make sure that those things that kids are led to believe today
I always wanted to go into
don't
podcasting.
change their future. Yeah, always podcasting. So we're working on making sure.
The point is we never know, because the things you end up doing are things that haven't been invented or thought of yet.
That is true. Well, just to kind of wrap that up.
By the way, I wouldn't recommend podcasting as a career. Private equity I would recommend, maybe not podcasting.
But we're working intently to make sure parental rights are protected. It's vital to the well-being of children.
I've been shocked, and sort of as I learned about all this over time. In 1934, the president of the National Education Association, the good old NEA, which was terrible in terms of all the things we're dealing with now, he wrote, "We expect to accomplish by education what dictators in Europe are seeking to do by compulsion and force." It was 90 years ago.
They're still doing it today.
Yeah. I think but you point out something I think is very interesting, because with COVID, parents started looking over their kid's shoulder. What are they looking on this computer? And they started finding about critical race theory and Howard Zinn's History of America, which has this terrible, having the, 1619 Project, which has the country founded on the day the first slave was brought into America, not 1776. All this radical stuff. Mm-hmm. That's the curriculum.
It's mind-blowing. Absolutely is.
Where'd you go to school?
I did my undergrad at George Fox University in Oregon, and then my master's and doctorate at Regent University. Yeah. And then later moved outside of Christian education and studied innovation and entrepreneurship at Stanford University in their School of Business and Engineering.
So you got a real education when you were growing up. You weren't indoctrinated by all of this.
High quality education, and that's a thanks to my parents. They made a lot of sacrifices so I could attend a school that aligned with their values. Did they homeschool you, or did you? I was able to attend Christian school, K through 12. Yeah. And there was high expectations, a culture of respect at the school, and we were prepared well for life, and really saw a purpose post high school, where today's kids, we've got a culture, this generation, where they're lost. They're lacking purpose, meaning in their life. And as we talked about earlier with the 10 Commandments, the absence of teaching basic morality, right and wrong, is such a disservice to this generation who needs those guardrails, who needs to know what is truth, what is not, and how to act accordingly for civil society, but also for their own human flourishing.
Mm-hmm. I so agree. Well, I think one of the things I hope, the purpose, one of my purposes in talking with you about this is I'd like to get people used to the idea we're not going to reform the existing public government-owned K-12. It's not reformable. What you can do, though, is you can create really interesting alternatives that are better, cheaper, faster, more humane, and teach good values. Those do exist. And we need more of it. And if we create more of it, then the K-12 monopoly is no longer a monopoly.
You're exactly right. And there's something that we all can do to get involved with this. Whether you have some financial means to help a family that doesn't have school choice in their state afford an alternative.
How do you do that?
You can contribute. Lots of grandparents are to their grandchildren's education, neighbors, people in community, whether it's church. They're seeing families whose children are trapped in these public schools. We're also seeing the business community, entrepreneurs come alongside and say, hey, I can start a micro school. I can use my facility, my company, and help prepare a pipeline of future workers, not just in the skills they need to work in my company, but they're already developing the relationships, and as well as developing the character, the work ethic that those employers want to see. And so we're seeing more and more of that. Just as one example, Dick DeVos in Michigan, 14 years ago, he was a front runner. He created an innovative school called the West Michigan Aviation Academy. And Dick saw there was a pilot shortage. Him being a pilot himself knew, hey, if I can get kids exposed to this now, they'll have the opportunity to have an on-ramp for post-high school success in a field that is high growth and high demand, as well as having the opportunity to teach this generation integrity, personal responsibility, how to work well with others. And so he's doing that. The school is absolutely thriving.
Yeah, he was a great guy, great man. Founded Amway.
Yes, and this is his oldest son, Dick.
Yeah. Well, Carrie, thank you. How do we find you? What are your coordinates?
Yes, you can find me at Discovery Institute. So our website is discovery.org/education. Host of information out there, as well as my email address. You can also connect with me on X. It's Carrie D. Ingraham is the handle. And glad to connect with anyone in your audience if I can be of help.
Well, thank you. And we'll have all this on the website on your guest page. And anyway, thanks all for joining and listening. I think hopefully we frame the issue for K-12 education in America and some of the lines of action we can take, and pointed you towards some of the things that you can do to improve it. And anyway, I hope you found this interesting, useful, and as always, send us comments along to our website or any one of our chat boards on the various platforms we're on, and look forward to talking with you next time. And Carrie, looking forward to having you back again sometime soon.
Thanks, Bill. My
Great.
pleasure.
Thanks. Good.